So please join me in welcoming Eleanor Wilner.
Campbell, after you told that story, I started taking poems out. Thank you so much, Jessica, for your powerful reading earlier. I believe the student has become the master. And thank you for your eloquence on my behalf. It's great to be the last reader because everyone is so happy to see you come up. Next stop, booze and bed. This marks the end of an exhilarating, over-the-top week, for which many thanks to so many, but especially Miles, Susan, Jennifer, Marcy, my terrific intern, Eddie, and with much affection to my amazing workshop community that made this week such a delightful. I can't think of a noun to go after that. And what a pleasure and a privilege to read with Laure-Anne and Campbell. Once more into the breach, folks. During these past 2 bewildering years, I kept hearing the voices of Shakespeare's 3 witches. Fair is foul and foul is fair. Those words, of course, open Macbeth, that play about the bewitching temptations of illicit power and its easy slide on slick blood and paranoia into tyranny. And I recall a conversation late in the play when the good man Macduff asks, "Stand Scotland where it did?" To which his compatriot Ross answers, "Alas, poor country, almost afraid to know itself." So this poem was written shortly after the shock of election night, and it registers that. Parable of the Eyes. Somewhere in America, on the plains, is a silo full of eyes. They are closed, shut tight, though now and then a few tears run, and a rivulet of salty water shudders the piles in the murk of those great bins, like storage lockers where people put things, stuff they can't remember why they bought. Once valued things that got in the way as they moved from here to there and there to here. Here, where the bells tolled day and night, deep bronze the sound. Its slow decay goes on, and the eyeless try to drown the sound. Sit down to the TV news. When the knock... Too much talking here. When the knock of the fist comes on the door, and you can hear the grinding of gears as the trucks pull up outside, and the eyes locked in the heartland silo suddenly blink and open wide, and all they see are other eyes in all that darkness staring back. Here's another bit of bummer lit from our moment. I'm bending an old story here to a new use. You probably know the speaker Daedalus, the Greek legend of his building the labyrinth to hide and imprison the monstrous half-man, half-bull, the Minotaur, and the fate of Daedalus' son Icarus when they attempted escape. Daedalus, the exile, thinks of his son. It wasn't the sun, or that he flew too high. Lots of boys do that and live. It wasn't that he didn't hear me, his father, shout to warn him. It wasn't that he was boy and dream and muscle and sheathed sword. It was whose son he was, not one of theirs. So, as he circled above them, wings spread in the pure delight of feeling free. It enraged them. They ranted. They recoiled. They took aim. In the labyrinth I built for the creature, the prison that became my own. The central chamber is empty now, its straw moldy. The creature has fled. I, who alone knew the plan of those bewildering corridors, returned. I led him out. His is the huge horned shadow you see, moving always a little ahead of you, always a little ahead of whatever happens next. And when they thought things couldn't get worse. This next poem has the chutzpah to try to think like a wolf. And not just any wolf, but the one that's deep in the Western dream time of the Lupercalian wolf. It was she in the old story who suckled the twins, Romulus and Remus, Romulus being the legendary founder of Rome. Not surprisingly, the father of the cast-off twins was Mars, the god of war, who will appear in the poem in the planetary version. So, let us learn mercy from the wolf. The title is a sentence that the poem completes. Being as I was, how could I help? It was the noise that drew me first, even before the scent. The long water had brought something to my den, spilling its banks, leaving the hollow pod of reeds in the cool mud. Whatever it was, it cried inside, and an odor rose from it. Man smell, but sweeter. 2 small hairless cubs were in it, pink as summer oleander, waving the little worm-like things they had instead of paws. Naked like that, they made my blood go slow, my dugs begin to drip. I tipped the pod, they slid into the ferns. I nuzzled the howling pair, they found my side. They suckled there and drank their fill. That night the red star in the sky was bright, a vulture's eye that waits with a patience that I hardly understand. The twin cubs slept in their shining skin, warm at my side. I dreamed. The trees were falling, one by one, the sound deafening, the dust that rose from one, a mist to hide the felling of the next. The mountains were cut in 2. Great stones were rolled and piled like hills until the sky was shut. Where the trees had grown, pillars of stone rose high, the birds circled, but their skulls struck the sky. Teeth to the earth, Our den fell in like a rotted log when weight is added to decay. Nothing to eat, the cubs howled, the flesh fell from our bones. We ran under a strange sky whose light was wrong. It rose from the city walls, bounced off the leaden heaven, flat as the sound of a stone striking mud. One of the brothers killed the other. Blood poured where the streams had run. Nowhere to drink, we slink from one rock to the next. Hunger drives us to the walls, where, sharp as the eyes of men, death waits with its 1,000 iron thorns. But the warm sun woke me. I forgot. The twins were all I saw for days. We lay together by the den. The river ran beside us like a friend. They drank and laughed at the morning light that played in the shelter of the leaves. Forgive me. I was wolf and could not help the love that flowed from me to them, the thin, sweet river of milk. Even now, though the world has come to match the dream, I think I would give it again. Drink a little more water. This is a kind of remnant situation, voice-wise here. You know, I was talking with an undergraduate class recently, and discovered kind of something I hadn't thought about, that they were 3 years old when 9/11 happened. They had come into the room at such a different time. And so I asked them about their feelings about violence and war and atrocity. And they, in general agreement, said they were desensitized. That was the word they used, from too much exposure on screens, in the news, the daily and distant harvest of violence that's dumped on us daily had numbed them. So they felt violence only when it affected them personally or someone very close to them. That was when they could feel it as real. So, what's that? The mic, thank you. Okay. So this is a poem that addresses that situation. In a time of war, flies caught in the sap of the living tree someday will be precious, dressed in amber. Just so the past appears to the present, gem-like in its perfect preservation. The hardened gold of yesterday, a relic through which today's sun shines. But those who are caught in the sticky sap of actual time, insects in the odds against them, who struggle in the ooze, slowly sink into the mass, the numberless anonymous dead, till the atrocious becomes the mundane, our senses numb from the sheer litany of repetition. Let us then just watch this one small, desperate fly, stuck first by the feet, and then in its struggles entangled entirely in the glob of sap, its wings heavy as a brass angel's, until it is all at once still, a dark speck in a bubble of sap oozing from the felled tree in a forest marked for the mill. How many millennia will pass before a teardrop lavalier of amber carrying its cargo of loss will adorn the vanity of another creature, the fly, a fossil of a species no longer present on the earth itself, a speck in a cosmos where galaxies are carded like cotton on a comb and pulled out into a distance where some new fabric is being spun and shimmers in the firelight of countless burning suns. This figure simply emerged out of the local air. The girl with bees in her hair came in an envelope with no return address. She was small, wore a wrinkled dress of figured cotton, full from neck to ankles, with a button of bone at the throat, a collar of torn lace. She was standing before a monumental house on the scale you see in certain English films, urns, curved drives, stone lions, and an entrance far too vast for any home. She was not of that place, for she had a foreign look and tangled black hair, and an icon, heavy and strange, dangling from an oversized chain around her neck, that looked as if some tall adult had taken it from his and hung it there as a charm to keep her safe from a world of infinite harm that soon would take him far from her and leave her standing as she stood now, barefoot, gazing without expression into distance, away from the grandeur of that house, its gravel walks and sculpted gardens. She carried a basket full of flames, but whether fire or flowers with crimson petals shading toward a central gold was hard to say, though certainly it burned, and the light within it had nowhere else to go, and so fed on itself, intensified its red and burning glow, the only color in the scene. The rest was done in grays, light and shadow, as they played along her dress, across her face, and through her midnight hair, lively with bees. At first, they seemed just errant bits of shade, until the humming grew too loud to be denied, as the bees flew in and out, as if choreographed in a country dance between the fields of sun and the black tangle of her hair. Without warning, a window on one of the upper floors flew open. Wind had caught the casement. A silken length of curtain filled like a billowing sail. The bees began to stream out from her hair, straight to the single opening in the high facade. Inside, a moment later, the sound of screams. The girl, who had through all of this seemed unconcerned and blank, all at once looked up. She shook her head, her mane of hair freed of its burden of bees, and walked away out of the picture frame, far beyond the confines of the envelope that brought her image here. Here where the days grow longer now, the air begins to warm, dread grows to fear among us, and the bees swarm. Okay, I'm going to read you two more poems. This one, really, all I knew about it was that the statues were restless. A couple of glosses on this one. The procession that appears in the first stanza is actually a kind of indelible image from the film The Last Emperor, about China's final emperor. And, I've heard that there exists at the Vatican a locked room full of the broken off genitals of the classical statues. Of course, this is only a rumor, but I think it's such a great idea. Be careful what you remember. Can you see them now, the statues? Can you see them stirring on their pedestals, trying out their stiff arms, stepping gingerly down, breaking the glass walls that encase them? At the Vatican, forcing the door of the locked room, tearing off the plaster of Paris, fig leaves, rummaging about in the heaps of broken off genitals, so that when they leave God's palace of art, like the eunuchs of China's final dynasty who left the palace for the last time, carrying in small jars the parts of themselves taken by empire, so too the statues would be whole now, heading home. They tear themselves from the fountains, leaving behind the public play of the waters, climb down from their candlelit niches, deserting their place in the great composition. They enter the long loneliness of roads, their exodus making a path from the cities, a gleaming white stream, like refugees returning to their distant, burned villages, their memories a desolation of marble. Day and night they travel, some leading the horses on which they've been mounted for years in piazzas, their postures heroic. All are on foot, even the gods unaccustomed to walking, and angels from tombstones, their wings hanging useless, scholars and poets, tall women in togas, a boxer with a broken nose, a hooded woman stumbling under her son's dead weight, an armless Venus, a headless victory, led by justice, the blindfold torn from her eyes. Their streams converging on the road to the mountains, they climb higher and higher. Like salmon returning to the waters that spawned them, the statues relentless make their way to the quarries from which they were hewn, the open veins in the heart of the mountain. An avalanche heard from a distance, rumbling and thundering, or an earthquake, a war begun, or a world ending. We could only guess what we had heard. Then word spread that the statues were missing. The fountains, the squares, the galleries stood empty. The gardens were vacant, the pedestals naked, the tombstones abstract. And it is true, where the quarries had been, you can travel there and see for yourself. The mountain is whole again, the great rift closed, and young trees grow thick again on the slopes. That poem made Tony mad. Tony Hoagland. I wanted to say his name tonight. This last poem. You know, Shelley famously boasted that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Now, wouldn't it be nice to think so? But what I do think is that poets are the translators of the unacknowledged world. And that world, as it becomes visible, is a reflection on the daylight world, seen as it so often is in a daze of denial. Probably the best thing you can say about poets is that they are unpopular with fascists. One of the initiating events in the tragic Spanish Civil War that announced the rise of fascism in Europe was the murder in 1936 of the great Andalusian poet Federico Garcia Lorca by the Falangistas of Franco, whose war cry was "Viva la muerte," long live death, and seldom are men so honest about their objectives. The next year in that war saw the bombing of Guernica, the first major bombing of a city, which would change warfare and make the majority of its victims from then on civilians. Lorca is for me emblematic of the poet. When asked what a poet was, he said, "Yo tengo un fuego en mis manos," I have a fire in my hands. So let us hope together that I have enough breath after this amazing week. Excuse me, I have to stay with the microphone. Thank you for that. To get through this. Up against it. The wall was white, whitewashed lime that shines in the sun till white is pure pain, searing the eyes. And the wall was marked, pocked by a spray of black holes, like nothing so much as the dots in a child's puzzle, waiting for a line to make sense of them, to pull from a scatter of points a familiar shape. At the beginning of the bad time, we have come to think of as usual, they stood a man here against this wall simply because of what he was, something that made it hard to do what they wanted. So they thought that if they killed him first at the very beginning, the rest would come easy. His blood like a red door opening into the future, in which the gypsy wind, capricious, always eluding them, would be stilled, tied in a sack. And the everyday, which wore them down into grit under its heels, would disappear into clouds of power. Their boots would be real leather, the rawhide smell from what they had taken and hadn't the time to cure. And if he were Lorca, Garcia Lorca, the writer with a fire in his hands, and he was, and if they stood him up against this wall, in its white that defeated the light, throwing it back like a knife into the eyes, and if, in that moment as they raised their guns, he remembered a dream he had dreamed but a month before, a dream of a lamb surrounded and butchered by shepherds. If all this were true, and it is, then we approach this wall at our cost, counting its black holes like the shrunken emblems of the cosmos eating back its own matter. And what then? Shall we paste up the placards of a revolution in which we no longer believe? Shall we tear down the wall knowing another stands behind it and another to the horizon of counting? Shall we line up the children beside it, pointing at each hole as a lesson through which, like a sieve, their hope will begin to drain out? Or shall we plant flowering vines along the wall to adorn the record? And when each tendril, each slow wavering filament, each unruly winding line of green is swaying along the wall, looking for somewhere to anchor its urge to go on growing, verde, te quiero verde. What then? Why, by then, in the long twilights, in the hard work of planting and watering, of watching and waiting, by then we may have understood what we can't now imagine, desperate as we are about the white wall, the holes in the shape of a man, the mark they wanted to leave us, the line terror taught us to trace. So different from the one that he left, the one whose shape left its trace in the heart, the balcony open, the long spill of stars in the sky, the track of creation's milky tongue, and listen, the shift and seethe of the sap, forcing its slow way toward the branching twigs, the ear-splitting crack as the end is opened by budding. A salt breeze in the orchard, the small leaves trembling with light.